Welcome to another exciting video of Mr. History. Today we are looking at the Sumerian King List, in my opinion the oldest history book of Homo Sapiens. There are many sources of the Sumerian King List, for example the Kish tablet or the most famous Weld-Blundell prism from Oxford. And also notable is the Babyloniaca of Berossus, a Greek translation of the King List. The Americans also have their tablet, the famous California tablet, which triggered the famous Berkeley paper from 1963, discarding the list as a myth. The oldest found version of the Sumerian King List was from around 2000 BC. It contains kings of Sumer, their reign length and the location of the kingship. It has two main parts. The first one is from 250,600 BC roughly to 9,800 BC until the Big Flood. And the second part starts after the flood and goes until 1817 BC. I just want to mention that the King List was very popular at that time and Abraham and the writers of the most ancient parts of the Bible knew it. But that is a story we later pick up. Here you see the overview of the main events of the King List. The list says, after the kingship descended from heaven, it was in Eridu. And you see a picture of Eridu, which is in southern Iraq nowadays. You can still visit it. And the first king was named Alulim. Sumerian tales also say that Adapa, and that sounds very like Adam, the first human lived at the same time as Alulim. This should have taken place in 250,600 BC. In roughly 9,500 BC, the list says that there was the Big Flood. And after that, the first king after the flood, Etana, went to heaven and consolidated all countries after the flood. A true ancient Marshall Plan, which rebuilt Europe after the Second World War. In 2600 BC, the King List's kings are matched by other archaeological records. Here you see all 8 kings of the pre-Diluvian or pre-flood era. The length of reign for normal human standards in 2020 is very long, but my advice, don't throw out evidence prematurely only because you can't explain it. As scientists, we should neutrally observe and not judge all the time. The Sumerian King List after the flood starts at roughly 9,500 BC and goes down to 1,805 BC. Here we show the list until Aga of Kish, and under the kings can match external sources. As you can see, it starts with Etana, the shepherd who ascended to heaven and consolidated all the foreign countries. And you also see that the reigning times is still longer than normal rulers, maybe with an exception of Merkel, but much shorter than the pre-flood rulers. Let's see what scholars have to say. The discussion about the King List is actually not that old, and the first paper was just released in 1906, roughly 100 years ago. Initially, they thought they could check the validity of the Bible, but after the Second World War, a Bible and ancient time critical time started in science. In 1963 in Berkeley, a religious critical university up to today and in the pre-time of Woodstock, published a leading paper calling it a fairy tale. As the Oxford Cuneiform Library nowadays writes, the optimistic view of the list as a historical document was soon met with a wave of skepticism as scholars began to turn attention to the ideological perspective, also known as not true, of the King List. The omission of several important historical dynasties and incredibly long reigns of some early rulers of the list. There you have it. The verdict was out and the King List was just put back into the drawer. The paper I was talking about was the most prominent paper published in 1963 by J.J. Finkelstein and is still referenced by papers today. And when you go to Wikipedia today, you find an article completely neglecting the value of its list. No evidence they ever reigned, mythical era, only corresponds to localized river flooding in comparison to world flood, and the best, it maps these numbers into more reasonable regnal length. And if you look at the page closely, Wikipedia also references heavily our friend Finkelstein from 1963. And look also at the dates of the other papers, 1923, 1963, 1961, 1983. The newest paper is 13 years old. But let's have a closer look at this paper where it's trying to attempt to map these numbers into more reasonable length. R.K. Harrison in 1993, so it's roughly 27 years ago, reinvestigated the antediluvian Sumerian King List. I made a small screenshot here, otherwise you wouldn't believe it. So, the factors involved are the square of base 60 multiplied by 8. When the base is isolated from the calculation, the remaining factor constitutes the actual length of the king reign. And this process can be expressed by a formula as follows: P divided by R minus equals to AT, where PR is the prism record, B is the base 60 raised to the power of 2 to give base 60 squared, and AT is the actual length of the king's tenure. So, is that really more realistic? I find that highly suggestive and more unbelievable. I have one or more two questions about the validity of that calculation. And so, as the papers and the researchers are so old and also highly biased based on a paper almost 60 years old, let's have a fresh view on our Sumerian King List. Here you see again our three main events with the recorded dates from the Sumerians. Let's try to see if they coincide with science. Well, that's a surprise. All main events are proven by science. Anthropology dates the appearance of the first Homo sapiens, not human, but the first Homo sapiens, to 248 to 348,000 BC. And it just happens with a coincidence that the ancient Sumerians guessed this date with the accuracy of a dart player hitting the bullseye. Secondly, the calculation of the flood of roughly 9806 BC, whereas the rough calculation comes not from them but from us, as we can only know that the later king lived roughly 2600 BC and we have to calculate backwards from there. Whereas Plato, the old Egyptians and modern geologists put them to roughly 9600 BC. Again, a very close similarity to the dates. And thirdly, you have worldwide tales and myth that are the flood that God or God's kids or angels or wise men came down from heaven helping to rebuild life. The Sumerians say that their king Etana went to heaven and consolidated foreign countries after the flood. So is that also a coincidence? And the fact that we suddenly find ancient wall structures showing the same way of constructions all over the world with these famous knobs, is that also a coincidence? So let's quickly look at Alulim, our first king, and Adapa, our first human, Homo sapiens. Here we see again the Alulim was ruling in Eridu, or what the Hebrews called Eden. And from the amazing book from anthropologist Madeleine Böhme, where she gives an overview of recent findings in anthropology, she shows us, and other sources too, confirm, just check Wikipedia here, that first humans arrived, Homo sapiens, arrived between 350 and 250,000 years ago. You might say, wait, Alulim, he was the first king. Yes, but he was not the first human. But the Sumerians believed that Enki, the god Enki, made the first human Adapa, or what the Hebrews call Adam, at the same time, and Adapa and Alulim, that they lived together. In Sultan Tepe in southern Turkey, they found a Sumerian apocryphal letter, together with 600 more clay tables, which was written from Adapa or Adam to Alulim. So the Sumerians thought that they lived at the same time. You wonder, these Sumerian tales, they sound very similar to the Bible. Would there have been a way that Abram or the early Hebrews might have known these stories? Well, good you ask. Sultan Tepe was only 25 kilometers from Haran, where Abraham and Terah, his father, were living. And that is the distance from Manhattan to JFK Airport. If you want, you can check that on Google Maps. So let's come to the flood. We can calculate from the reign of En-mi-Baraksi that the Sumerians put the flood to roughly 9805 BC. In ancient times, Solon, Herodot and Plato talked about the destruction of Atlantis through this big flood. Old Solon sailed in 590 BC from Athens to the Sais temple close to Alexandria and Cairo and had a workshop with a priest there. They told him their knowledge about the destruction of Atlantis. As you see here, Plato wrote this down later, and he said, I will briefly tell you about their laws 9,000 years ago and the most beautiful things that they have done. As you see, Solon was in Egypt 580 or 590 BC and Atlantis was destroyed 9,000 years before, so that it means it was destroyed roughly 9,600 BC. But let's not just believe the old-timers, let's focus on the NASA and geologists from today. The NASA recently found a huge crater of an asteroid impact in Greenland, and that crater was 31 kilometers wide. That's the reason for the famous meltwater pulse 1b. The meltwater pulse 1b is a sudden rise of water level 9,600 BC, exactly when Atlantis vanished and the Sumerians say the flood appeared. This is very important because it contradicts the belief of the scholars that the Sumerians just talked about the local river flood. This flood was Armageddon level here. And as you see in 9,600 BC, the temperature rose by 10 degrees in Greenland, meaning the ice was melting like crazy. And you see here this peak in 9,600 BC, the sudden rise of temperature. And the water level rose at the same time by 80 meters. I just want to compare this to today's discussion. You see the Google screenshot on the right, and in 2019 a study projected that the sea levels will rise by 69 centimeters, and that already has a devastating effect. And as a proof of the flood, you also find many ancient constructions today underwater, like Yonaguni at the coast of Japan and Bimini Road in the Bahamas. Finally, let's turn to Etana, our ancient Marshall Plan. Etana was the shepherd who ascended to heaven and consolidated all the foreign countries after the flood. The Anden culture, for example, as the other side of the coin, says that the sun god, after sending a devastating flood, caused his son to teach the arts of civilization to the survivors. And that might also explain why we find all over the world constructions of ancient structures with the same technology and these famous knobs everybody is talking about. All in all, we have here an ancient artifact which would explain many things we see today, and of which we can't make any sense of, as the same cultural techniques used all over the world in ancient times, and the sudden appearance of Homo Sapiens 250,000 years ago, and the conformity of ancient world tales about a person or being from the skies rebuilding their culture. So are all these things one big coincidence, or is the Sumerian King List the oldest history book of Homo Sapiens? What do you think? If you like this video, please click the like button and hit the subscribe button. Until then, don't stop asking questions. Your Mr. History.